Hi guys, Goffy here and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to answer one of the most frequently asked questions I get. And that is, why do you choose to shoot a Leica camera when at this price point, arguably you could pick just about anything. You could have the best Sonys, the best Canons, you could probably have some pretty good medium format Fujis as well. And in today's video, that's what I want to try and answer. Why is it that some people choose to buy these cameras, and why for some people it actually makes quite a lot of sense even though the price is pretty astronomical. And importantly, during this video, I'm not trying to convert you and tell you that you should get a Leica. All I'm trying to describe is why for some other people, this might make sense. Me being one of those people. And during the course of the video, I'm gonna share some footage and photos from a trip that I took down to Lulworth Cove and Durdle Door last weekend. It's a super pretty part of the UK, and I just really wanna share those images. So first of all then, the big thing for me and an awful lot of my audience over on Instagram is the fact that you're getting an awful lot of image quality in a really small size. Now, notice that I'm saying image quality and not necessarily performance. I'm not talking about frames per second and stuff like that. I'm talking about raw image quality. Now, if you take the current Leica M11, I think there's this view that Leica is very expensive and a bit inferior. But if you take the sensor out the Leica M11 and look on the DxOMark website, it's actually the highest scoring full frame sensor on their site. It shares that place with I think 2 or 3 other cameras, and it's only beaten out by some medium format cameras. So from a sensor point of view, you are genuinely getting some of the best, although at a very high price. The other side of this as well, I guess away from the sensor, is the lenses. The lenses, Leica, are well known for making some of the best out there. And all of this kind of combines together in a really small package. Now, a lot of that's to do with the fact that there's a lot of functions arguably like missing, like autofocus being probably the main one, because if this lens had autofocus, it'd probably be 3 times bigger. But being able to get all of that image quality in such a small package is one of the big selling points. I can't think of a camera that is smaller that provides better image quality. Continuing on then from that lack of features ends up being one of the things that a lot of people reached out to me on Instagram and said they enjoyed. And that might sound really counterintuitive, but it's bare bones. What do you actually need to do to take a picture? You need some sort of way of setting your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. You need some sort of way of focusing, and then finally a finger to press the shutter. Everything else built into your camera beyond their very basic functions is there to aid you. And if it's not aiding you and you could strip them away, then maybe you'd end up with a camera that looked an awful lot like one of these, a Leica M. But if you're somebody that does need those functions, like, I don't know, you do wildlife photography, so you need good autofocus, or like sports photography, then a camera like this will make no sense at all. But I think for an awful lot of people out there, they end up taking these very kind of high-tech cameras and using very little. If it comes to photography, and I'm using my XH2S that I'm recording this on now, I'm definitely that guy. I end up using basically none of the features that the camera offers. I end up having this camera for either some like niche photo projects or recording video like I am now. I've always thought that maybe a Leica M does fit a little bit better in a collection with an alternative where you can make up for the pitfalls like wildlife photography, sports, that sort of thing. So I think for me, having both cameras means I enjoy this camera a little bit more. If it was just this camera that I owned, I would struggle to make YouTube videos, that's for sure, but I could definitely see how some of the pitfalls might become more annoying. Next up then, and it follows on very well from the lack of features, is this feeling like you're getting better at photography at its core. Because this camera lacks aids, when it actually comes to taking a picture, there is far more involvement from me, myself, when it comes to taking a picture as opposed to cameras like my XH2S. And because of that, I feel like I genuinely have got better at photography, because when I first got my Leica M240, the thought of going nearly fully manual at times was very daunting, and now it's become kind of second nature at times. I kind of go through this mental checklist now when I take an image of a camera like this, where I'm like, what do I actually want to capture here? Do I want a fast aperture? Do I want a slow one? Where in the image do I actually want to focus? And all of that kind of process ends up resulting in me taking better, more thought out images. At the start, this process definitely made me miss images, and I would like get settings completely wrong and then be like, oh no, I've messed that opportunity up. But ultimately, I ended up knowing why I'd made the mistake, because it was me that had dialed something in wrong, and it felt like I learnt from this camera. Another one that someone over on Instagram reached out and highlighted to me was the fact that these cameras kind of get you out of that planned obsolescence that these companies out there often kind of put into their development cycles. If you're not sure what planned obsolescence is, it's where companies purposely make things outdated quite quickly. A really good example of this will be Apple with the iPhone. They bring out one every single year, and it makes you feel like your phone is suddenly inferior because there's this brand new shiny one out there, when the reality is that's not really the case. Sony as a camera brand used to be the worst for this. They'd have like yearly upgrade cycles and you'd find yourself constantly chasing the next big thing. Sony and that have kind of slowed down a little bit now. I think camera development itself has slowed a little bit, but cameras like the Leica M240 and the Leica M10 and the M11 have really big upgrade gaps between them. I think the gap between the M10 and the M11 ended up being something like 5 or 6 years, so it kind of gets you out of that kind of desire to permanently be upgrading your stuff. And this is probably also why these cameras hold their value so well, because there's not really a huge amount of difference between an M10 and an M11 in many ways. These cameras hold their value so well. If you enter the market at a used price, they end up pretty much holding their value and you don't lose much. And for me, that ends up being a pretty big part of this YouTube channel. YouTube maintains this hobby, but if I had lots of depreciating gear, YouTube just wouldn't cover that gap. But because this stuff doesn't really depreciate, it ends up being a pretty good way of maintaining value within my camera gear. Next up then, and it's going to depend a lot on how you feel when it comes to this sort of thing, and that's the build, design, and how these cameras are made. Now, one of the reasons I pick this camera up all the time, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, is the fact that it just feels so good. And these cameras are also handmade or put together in Germany as well, and whether that's a good enough reason to spend more money on something is definitely personal opinion. I think the best analogy for this is a little bit like an Amiga and maybe an Apple Watch. I think if you're an Apple Watch owner, you can understand why somebody might spend 10 times as much on a mechanical watch. Essentially, it still just tells the time, but there's brand heritage there, there's design, there's craftsmanship, and at the same time, an Amiga owner fully understands why somebody else gets all of the benefits from having an Apple Watch with all of its fitness and extra features and all of that sort of stuff. And I think we end up in a pretty similar kind of debate here. Even if you're somebody that doesn't want to spend extra money, maybe you can appreciate why maybe somebody else would. Next up then, let's talk manual focus, because as bonkers as it might seem, for some of us, manual focus is all we need. If we take a look at my own personal photography, I generally do posed portraits and landscapes in terms of travel photography. Now, if I want to take a picture of a landscape, I just flick myself over to infinity and I'm basically done. That's all I need. And then when I do want a portrait and I do need to focus up, I'm gonna have to look through the rangefinder. And to be honest, it will probably be a little bit slower than using autofocus. But at the end of the day, I can still consistently do it in under half a second, and it makes next to no difference in my own photography. Now, if you're somebody that is shooting fast moving subjects, then the experience of a rangefinder, to be honest, is pretty horrendous. But at the same time, for me personally, it fits 99% of the images that I take. And if you gave me the choice of having autofocus or a camera that's half the size, I'm gonna pick the camera that's half the size, because for most of my images, I don't need autofocus. And if I really do, that's when I'm reaching for an alternative camera. And then finally then, one that is a little bit niche, and that is the fact that you can take one set of lenses and use it on both digital and film camera bodies. The Leica M mount has been going for nearly 70 years, and no other camera brand out there can you take a camera from 70 years ago and attach the lenses that have just come out, or take the brand new camera and put lenses on it that was made nearly 70 years ago. That flexibility for me is something that I get a lot of use out of, being able to again pack two very small camera bodies and multiple very small lenses into a tiny space is pretty much unmatched by any other camera brand out there. And I find myself doing that quite a lot. I'll often take the M10 and the M6 on the same trip, and being able to share camera lenses and fit them in such a small area is a big plus to me personally. So hopefully then that helps explain why somebody might choose to buy a very expensive and seemingly obsolete camera. There's actually a lot of value in it for a very specific type of person, and that person ends up being people like myself. Now, I'm not trying to sell Leica cameras to you. If you've got different requirements to me, it probably makes no sense at all, but hopefully that's helped describe why some other people out there might be actually making a very sensible choice when they choose these cameras. Now, if you've watched this video from the perspective of somebody who is a Leica shooter and there's something that I've really missed and it was a bit obvious, then let me know down in the comments, because I'm really interested to know what is it that drew you to these cameras in the first place. If you've enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like and subscribe. There's plenty more content like this coming, and I hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.